Hi, BookTube. Bill Ruttenberg here with the Ruttenberg Library. Wanted to come to you this morning with a book chat. I recently read John Keegan's book, The American Civil War, A Military History, and thought that was a good read. It was quite interesting. It's a one-volume history of the Civil War. It's not super big. It is from Alfred A. Knopf out of New York, and it is a 2009 book. This book is, let's see, total 396 pages. The actual text for the reading is 365 pages. So with that being said, it had some things I liked about in the book was it had some maps throughout in various chapters that helped explain the battles, and I'm a map guy. I really like maps, and so it had several of those throughout that helped, as he was talking about different battles, bring the story along, helped you visualize things. One thing I didn't like about the book is when you go to the sources, and I don't mean to second guess a top-notch historian, because I know he's good. I know he's written several histories, but his sources, if you look here, are very, very limited with his notes and sources. And I really didn't like that. I would like to have seen more notes. And his bibliography is, I mean, it's okay, but it's not very extensive. And when you're doing a history of an entire war, I would like to see a little bit more there. But again, I'm not one who probably should second guess a very, very intelligent man when it comes to warfare. And I know there's a lot of people that read him and love him. I've got a couple other books on my shelf by him. I just haven't got to them yet. But so this is my first John Keegan book. But again, I enjoyed the book. I really did. And it was a pretty much it strictly stuck to military history, as the title tells you. He did give some chapters that briefly explain some different things going on. He spent 21 pages on the North and South divide, so talked about basically the slavery issue and what was dividing these nations and the cultural differences between the two. And there was a part in there I didn't like where when he was talking about slavery, I don't want to say he's justifying it in any way, but there was a part in there where he went a little bit easy on the Southerners, and I don't know if he's just trying to get a understanding of what was going on or what, but I didn't like that because I don't think that slavery should ever be handled lightly. I think it was an extremely serious issue and needs to be dealt with that way. So anyway, he also went through, just kind of going through the chapters here. Will there be a war? So there's some pages talking about that. You got improvised armies. So he talks about the very quick buildup of some armies that are just not really prepared to fight the war that they're about ready to fight. Running the war. So he talks about the administration and who's in charge and who makes decisions and how smoothly that goes. One of the big things that he hits on in here as I'm going through these chapters is the military geography of the Civil War. I felt that in this book, that was really one of the key themes he ran through the whole book. And for me personally, I thought that was kind of interesting because what he was saying made total sense on the geography of the United States and how it affected the Civil War and the fighting and the battle and the campaigns and stuff. And I knew that, I had read it, but I had just never seen it put together like he did. And I think my biggest take from this book is how he talks about geography. And he also does some interesting things with the generals that were fighting in the Civil War. So anyway, he talks about the life of the soldier, so he breaks down the Northerner versus the Southerner. And I took actually both of those chapters and I actually uploaded it to my 8th graders because they were short chapters, but very, very interesting. And so, and I thought fairly easy to understand. So I gave those to my 8th graders to read, and as part of our Civil War unit. And then he goes through basically the main campaigns of the war, talks about the generals, the fighting, and again the geography and how that affected. He talks about technological changes. So the Navy, especially, does a whole chapter on the Navy and how the Civil War totally revamped the American Navy, took it from being backwards to forwards, basically. He talks about the life of black soldiers. He talks about life on the home front. Talks about, I thought there's an interesting chapter, Walt Whitman and wounds. So he talks about disease and like surgery and stuff like that during the Civil War. It was short and sweet chapter, but very pointed in what it was trying to get across. He talks about the generals, the battles, how could the South have survived? He just reflects back, could they have ever even won this war? And then, of course, the end of the war. Now, what I really like about this book is there's 23 chapters, and they're all fairly short. They're short, sweet, and to the point. And the stuff that he talks about, they're short chapters, but yet when I'm reading it, it feels like I'm getting an extremely detailed account, even though I know I'm not, just because, total page numbers. I know he's not giving as much detail and stuff as, like, say, a James McPherson in the Battle Cry of Freedom. It's not the same type, but I feel very detailed when I'm reading it. I thought he did an excellent job as far as that goes. He put a lot of information into a small number of pages, and it was fairly easy to understand. I mean, there was nothing difficult about it. So for the rest of this, what I would like to do is I took some book notes on some things that I would like to share with you, and how they impacted me in my learning on the Civil War. I thought it was interesting, and maybe you'll find them interesting and want to read this book also. So so these are just direct quotes out of the book that I took that I probably will use in the future with my 8th grade class as we talk about the American Civil War. So he says, and I quote, "Mid-19th century armies hovered on the brink of true modernization, half belonging to the military past when martial vigor and numbers were alone thought to count, but already entering the military future when technology would predominate. The underdeveloped South was linked to the past, and the North was being transported by the Industrial Revolution into the future." So he really hits on that idea that the Civil War is the in-between war. The war that connects the past to the present, and how being with the present and being with the current technology is really what gave the North an absolutely huge advantage. And there's going to be reasons for that. Being the northern states being industrialized, where the southern states, for the most part, were not. And in order to become a forward-thinking nation, the Confederate States really had to go, militarily thinking anyway, had to go abroad to get that modern weaponry, because they just did not have the industrial output to do that. And so he talks a lot about that. I thought that was interesting. He also points out on page 63, it could win victories only by superior military leadership, since it had no hope of bettering the North in numbers, in the output of military goods, or in superiority of military technology. As many well-placed men in the North knew, since so many of them had been at West Point with their opponents, the South possessed a remarkable number of talented commanders. And so, he really hits on how these commanders all worked together at West Point. They knew each other, and a lot of those, big names commanders went to the South, went with their states, and that really plays havoc on the leadership of the Northern of the Union in the beginnings of this war, when they were struggling to find the right commander to put in command. And so let's move forward here. So page 63, it also says it was an insoluble predicament, incapable of winning without foreign assistance, but able to extract such support only if it were victorious. So it's talking about this. Keegan's talking about the Southern predicament, that the only way they can win is to get foreign aid, but the only way to get foreign aid is to win. So it's kind of a cycle they could never really get past. It becomes a roadblock for them. Page 66, he's talking about, throughout the book, he talks about different commanders as they come up in chronologically in the storyline. He says Lee was not really a strategist, though he was a brilliant tactician and operational leader. It may be argued that Lee's failure was in lack of boldness. Now, this is something for me personally. I've never heard this, because I've always heard that Lee was the bold general for the South. He was the guy willing to take chances and all of this. And Keegan's going opposite of that. He downplays Robert E. Lee quite a bit, and he more goes towards the idea that Robert E. Lee was great because the Union generals at the beginning of the war were not. And I know that, but I had never really hit on it as him being a failure, for lack of boldness. I always felt that Robert E. Lee was bold, and after the 7 Days Campaign, when he takes it to the north, I mean, that was a pretty bold move, evacuating the capital and everything. But anyway, that was just me and my take. Maybe there's a whole lot more books out there on that kind of stuff than I know of. Let's see. Page 73. The American Civil War was to prove one of the most ferocious wars ever fought, a factor of its geography. Again, he's going to come back to this time and time again on geography. Since the enemy's personnel, in the absence of obvious geographic objectives, presented itself as the only target at which to strike. And so they get what I call with my kids this capture the flag mentality. Get the other guy's capital and you win the war. And this becomes a major, major issue. It's something that really draws the war out a whole lot longer than it should have been. Let's see, page 91, he says, Lincoln, the military innocent, grew in stature and competence until eventually he came to dominate the war as no other individual did. And he really hits on how, not that Lincoln was a genius by any means, but he caught on to what needed to be done through his personal studies at the beginning of the war. And it didn't take Lincoln long to, right after the first battle of Bull Run, Lincoln's talking to Halleck, and he gives a big old long, I won't read it, but he gives a big old long thing that says, we can't go try to capture points. We got to go after the army, and we got to go after it in mass. You got to attack on a whole lot of different fronts at one time. And that really takes away their advantage of being able to move the army, the Southern Army, being able to move within their interior lines and being able to move people. The North needs to take advantage of their numbers. And he said this early on, and he figured that out. And it's not till, basically not till Grant gets there that they really start doing that. Page 95, he says, the inadequacy of available maps infuriated and tantalized Civil War generals. So he hits on this through the whole book, that the United States was not properly mapped out. And so none of the generals know, unless you're, the only ones that found success were the local leaders, the guys who knew the geography. And Keegan really pounds this into your head. I mean, he doesn't like, it's something that I pick up throughout the reading. Okay, he says even Confederate generals operating inside their own territory could express frustration at the lack of maps showing ways through. Northern generals usually, and I can't read my own writing, inside the Confederate territory, they found fault with everything. So they're just having troubles getting stuff done because they don't exactly know what's ahead. They have no maps that are properly. Nothing's properly mapped out. Page 122. Again, hitting on the importance of geography. He says, in combination, the feeder streams of Chesapeake Bay make it one of the most easily defensible and therefore militarily difficult regions for offensives anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere. Little wonder that McClellan, inexperienced and overpromoted, isolated in Washington as general-in-chief at the beck and call of a president whom he did not understand, and without friends and supporters of his own, leapt at the opening presented to him by his perception, if one may guess that this was what came to him, that the inaccessibility of the Confederacy might be cracked by disregarding the obvious overland route, and instead seeking to appear on the South's back doorstep by amphibious means. And so Keegan does something here that I thought was kind of way different than anything else I had read. He is giving McClellan a lot of credit for his Peninsula campaign, where if you look at a map, most of the rivers and streams in Virginia, they run east to west. So if you're going from north to south, you're having to cross over a whole bunch of pretty good size rivers. And when you've got an army of that size, that takes a lot of time. It's very difficult. So you could easily throw up defenses. The South could. And so he really plays on that, capture the flag mentality of, going north and south with your armies is one of the most difficult things to do. And so when McClellan proposes to go out and around and then go basically parallel to most of the rivers, he thinks that is genius plan. The only problem is McClellan's obviously not the guy to pull off the plan. And so he gives credit to McClellan that typically I have not seen. McClellan usually is given credit for being a very good organizer and planner and getting, logistics, getting supplies. But when it comes to actual fighting, he's terrible. So I just thought that was kind of interesting. Here's another one on another note I took on geography. At the outset, however, the shortage of troops made fighting difficult to organize, as did the ignorance of the terrain. Since the leading northern generals were confined by the geography of northern Virginia, which lay on the capital's doorstep, it is not surprising that the distant, sparsely inhabited, and largely unmapped lands bordering the Mississippi and the Gulf should have failed to focus clearly or quickly in their military minds on either side. Lack of information put regular troops at a disadvantage. The most effective fighters were locals who knew the ground firsthand and could exploit their intimacy with it. So this is one of the reasons when we get into 1862, 1863, General Grant, when he heads towards Vicksburg, when he makes that decision, we're going after Vicksburg, it makes it very difficult because not only are the maps not very good, there just aren't any. It's unmapped territory, and geography really plays a role in the war stretching out for a long period of time for General Grant. If you watch that movie the other night, they hit on this really well in the movie, in that documentary on History Channel, where he tried this, tried that, and tried the other to get to Vicksburg. He had to go through many different plans, and he took a lot of criticism for that. But in reality, it wasn't necessarily Grant's fault. It was the terrain. It was very difficult terrain to fight in. So, let's see. On page 140, he says, the blockade was a killer to Confederate ambitions. It was only because the South was a backward region whose population was accustomed to life at the margin and that it was able to survive privations as long as it did. So, the blockade that the Union put on, what Keegan's saying, was detrimental to the South. They couldn't get things in and out for the most part. Yes, they're still able to smuggle, but they're not smuggling enough to prolong this war. And this really handicaps them. And the only thing they got going for them is they were already backwards. So most of the fighting force are poor, and so they're already used to going without. Going on little rations is not really that big a deal it's a big deal, but they're able to do it because they're used to it. And then moving forward here, let's see here. Oh, he talks about Stonewall Jackson. He says, what distinguished Jackson was his deeply religious temperament, his very difficult character, and the fact that he was a military genius. The only truly original soldier besides Grant to emerge from this conflict. And I always praise Jackson. I think Jackson was awesome. But another thing that Keegan talks about, I didn't quote it, but he says it quite a few times in in various places in the book there that Jackson was very, very good on the spot, but he would not have been a very good overall commander. He gives him no props as being able to maybe take a bigger job. He was good in the job that he was doing. And part of that was he didn't do very good with plans. He was on the spot, in football, calling an audible. He was very good at calling an audible and reading the terrain and figuring out what needed to happen on the spot. And he gives him a lot of credit for that, but being an overall commander, he did not think he was very good. Another thing that really caught me off guard, Keegan gives Daniel Sickles credit where at Gettysburg, where he pushes his men forward in the line, and most people that I have read anyway have greatly criticized Sickles for this. They blame him for the loss of life, and Keegan actually says this might have saved him. I thought that was pretty interesting. Let's see here. Here's on page 230, he takes this note of General Grant, and nothing in his manner or appearance suggested that he was anything but a common sense, down-to-earth fighting soldier. Common sense and down-to-earth are among the most valuable qualities. However, that as a strategist can possess and can be possessed that a strategist can possess. And he possessed them in abundance. Sorry about that. And he goes on to say he was not a wait and see, but a go and see general, as his conduct after Chattanooga showed. So he doesn't just wait and see what's coming at him. He goes. He pushes his army. And they really hit on that in that documentary as well. Thought that was really cool. Let's see, page 238. McClellan, though he had not expressly voiced the perception, had correctly seen at the outset that to use the Army of the Potomac to butt its way southwest from one river to the next would waste its strength and do the Confederates a favor. His scheme to bypass the region altogether by an amphibious but flanking movement to the Virginia Peninsula was strategically brilliant, and one for which he has never received correct credit. So that's just hitting on the McClellan thing I was talking about earlier. He didn't get credit for that like he probably should have. But then he comes back to say, McClellan, a brilliant organizer who retained to a surprising degree the confidence and affection of his men, may be thought the worst general of the war, and his reputation has suffered greatly in the war's aftermath. Yet his is one of the most interesting psychological cases in military history. A first-class military mind capable of achieving great results at leisure, but utterly incapable of overcoming difficulty, even perhaps particularly imagined difficulty. So really hitting on, when it comes to getting into the actual battle, he wasn't very good. He was always worried about what the other side, how many troops did the South have, and made him hesitate. And here's one peg over at the history shelf I like, this quote. It's going to talk about Grant. This is from page 328. Grant was the greatest general of the war, one who would have excelled at any time in any army. He understood the war in its entirety and quickly grasped how modern methods of communication, particularly the telegraph and the railroads, had endowed the commanders with the power to collect information more quickly and the means to disseminate appropriate orders in response. And then he goes on to say Sherman and Grant were the two outstanding generals of the war. He just bluntly says it, and I thought that was pretty good because those are two guys I like to read about. Let's see here. Page 358, he says there was another element of resistance that had to be overcome and which never relented. That was the military geography of the war. So there's the geography thing again. It supplied the South with its most formidable ally and the North with its most unyielding opponent. Time and again, in almost every account of the conduct of campaigns, the obstacles which most happened, the North's armies in their pursuit of victory were terrain and landscape. The enormous distances to be traversed, the multiplicity of the waterways to be crossed, the ubiquity and impenetrability of forests, the gradient and contour of mountain ranges, and in a real sense, the North was fighting the country itself in its struggle to overcome the South. And there was quite a bit more. I'm not going to read it, but anyway, that's the last particular note I wanted to point out. But I thought this book by John Keegan, The American Civil War, A Military History, was a great book. I thought it was very interesting. I just wanted to share with you some high points from the book that I liked. Hope this helps you. I've been trying to get a way to do, I don't want to do reviews. I don't know that I've read enough to do reviews on stuff like this. I once thought that I had read a lot until I got to BookTube. So I like these book chats. This is what I've been thinking about doing. Tell me what you think. If you like my book chat, if you like what I'm pointing out and you want to discuss stuff, leave comments down below. And thank you for watching BookTube. I appreciate your time. Have a great day.